Using a personal narrative to help tell your story when you're making a presentation can be a really helpful technique. What I want to do here in 3 very short slides and a brief conversation is to explain the difference between using anecdotal evidence and using a personal narrative. We see anecdotal evidence all the time. Let me give you the current classic example, and then I'm going to flip this idea when I talk about how to use a personal narrative on the same topic. So oftentimes we hear in political circumstances or on the internet or social media, in the debate about climate change, someone will say, well, today it's really cold where I live. What happened to climate change? Well, that's an anecdote, and it has to do with that day's weather, and it has nothing to do with climate, and more important, it has nothing to do with data, research, or science. It's an observation at a time and a place, and that individual is attempting to use that moment in time to make a case for a larger issue. That is not a personal narrative. When you use anecdotal evidence, you are attempting to make your case without supporting research or statistics or data. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about trying to use a personal narrative. A personal narrative is a way to help explain or help personalize the information or the data that you will be providing or that you have provided in your presentation. When I was a newspaper editor, I would teach the reporters to use this technique from time to time. If they were dealing with a subject that included a lot of data, the best way to get into that subject was to personalize it in some way, to use a real example, but not to use the example as the whole story, but to use the example to get into the story, to help to personalize and create a narrative for the data they're going to cite later. This is also useful in making a presentation. It helps you create pathos, and I've described pathos in other lessons, and pathos is discussed in your textbook. The other thing to remember is that it needs to be coherent. In other words, it needs to help complete the circle of the story, and it's not the story or the presentation by itself. It needs to support and be supported by actual scientific data or research. Just to reinforce my own point, I went to research myself to help us understand the use of narrative in providing evidence. And I'm just going to read this and then let you contemplate the appropriate roles. So a narrative use of evidence is defined by the different roles that evidence plays in the plot of a narrative, depending on which narrative element is addressed by a given piece of the evidence. Now I know that's a little circular and it's written in academic language. The whole point here is that there is a direct connection between these two things, between the narrative, the telling of a story, the observational part, and the statistical analysis or data that you're going to be using. In other words, it is great if you start a presentation by telling a personal story that then helps illustrate the evidence you're going to be providing, or if you want to provide the evidence and then tell your personal story. It doesn't have to be your story. It can be a story that you've heard. It can be one that you've read. It can be somebody else's story. But when you humanize the presentation, it can be very powerful, but you need to do it in a way that is supported by and supports the additional statistical analysis, the additional research, the additional data you are providing. I'm going to go back to climate change to, as I said, sort of flip the narrative a bit on how I started this. I play tennis every Sunday morning through all seasons. We obviously in Idaho we go inside when the weather turns bad, but all spring, summer, and fall we're playing outside. And one of the things that we have observed is that there are more times now in the summer than when I was playing, say, 20 years ago, when we want to start earlier in the morning than we used to, because by 10 or 11 o'clock, it's already in the mid to high 80s in some cases. These are not typical, but it used to almost never happen. Now, by itself, that is meaningless because I'm just observing a personal experience that may or may not have anything to do with the larger world. However, I can use that to help illustrate, and it's a very basic illustration. There are better ones out there in which there are places in the world where everything is changing. One example of this would be the wildfires in Canada this summer. This is the summer of 2023, and they are having unprecedented wildfires caused by the early onset of heat and dryness. Again, that by itself may or may not be dispositive. It may or may not be indicative of a larger issue. However, when you use that and then you have data to support what the narrative you're telling, the story you're telling, and in this case, the research I'm citing here indicates that a survey of surveys indicated that somewhere between 90 to 100%, and in the most recent surveys, this was 2016, there are surveys that are coming out now in 2023 indicating that it's basically 99 to 100% of science climatologists universally agree that climate change is real and it's human caused. So that's the science, the research, the data that connects back to the narrative, the story, and vice versa. The story is based on real data. So when you're thinking about using a narrative or a personal observation, make sure that you have the supporting data and research to connect your narrative to real research and vice versa, so that they each support the other.